When I first bought this GMT400 Suburban back in October of last year, I immediately fell in love with it and started planning a whole list of modifications and upgrades that I wanted to do to improve both the performance and the cosmetics of this 20-year-old SUV. And I feel like I've got a pretty good game plan in mind, and we're going to change everything from the amount of horsepower that this 7.4-liter big block produces to the complete look of the truck, more or less. But before I could get to any of that, there was one thing that completely bugged me. And in fact, I obsessed over it to try to find the best solution for the problem. And I couldn't sleep until I finally came up with a plan. And today, that plan is going to go into action. Now, this problem or a complaint that I'm talking about is the narrow rear track width. You see on the front, the wheels sit more or less flush with the outside of the fender flare, but on the back, as you can tell, they stick in quite a bit. And I hate how this looks. So, like I said, I came up with a plan, and I think it's the best solution for this problem. It's definitely not the easiest, because the easiest would be just to throw some wheel spacers on there and be done with it. But I kind of figured if I could come up with a way to solve 2 or 3 problems at once, it would kind of make sense to do what I'm going to do, and that's completely swapping the rear axle. You see, this is a really strong differential. It's a 14-bolt full floater. It has 410 gears, which is great, but it has drum brakes and it has an open differential, and those two are kind of marks against it. So to increase the width, gain a limited slip, and disc brakes, I'm going to be swapping to this, which is a 2005 Chevy Express. That's a van, 3500 series. It's a Dana 70 Super axle. Like I said, factory disc brakes, 410 limited slip, and this is the axle that is going to cure the problem that I cannot stand of that narrow rear track width. Now, whenever I went through and I cleaned up this axle, and if you haven't seen this yet, you definitely should go check out the videos, but I just tack welded the spring perches on, kind of matching up the angle of the stock Chevy Express perches, but they're a little bit narrower to match the GMT400 chassis. But I need to do a test fit to make sure that they're going to fit and that the pinion angle is correct for the older GMT400. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to pull out the 14 bolt. I'm going to take some comparison measurements just to make sure that the angle is exactly where it needs to be. I'll make my shock tabs, I'll weld everything on, paint the axle tubes, and then finally I'm going to get this thing under the Suburban, put the wheels on, and I'm going to hope it looks exactly how I envision it. So I got the 14 bolt pulled out on Friday afternoon. Now it's Tuesday morning. We just had the Memorial Day weekend, so we're back to work. And I just wanted to show you a couple things on the Dana 70, which I realized I hadn't shown you in the last upload, just kind of to finish up the braking system. Last time you guys did see the axle, we got the new stock disc brakes mounted up, but I hadn't done any of the brake lines yet. So let me show you real quick. Remember, this is a Chevy Express axle, but these are 2500 HD disc brake hoses because on the Chevy Express, they go from here straight up to the frame, but I wanted the more traditional center style mount. So 2500 HD flex hoses, that's a stock bracket. For some reason, this passenger side brake hose did come with a bracket. The driver's side did not, but I made up just a quick little L bracket right there. It might be kind of hard to see. I was also waiting on some, these banjo bolts right here. These are M10 by 1.0. It's a Dorman. I'll put the part number on the screen here. And then I just bent up some standard 3/16 brake line. This is a metric bolt here, but this is a SAE thread there, which is perfect because that uses the same thread as the Suburban flex hose right there. So anyway, bent up some hard lines, made a little jog to clear the spring perch. Plenty of room for the U-bolts to go through there. I do have yet to bolt on a little tab. I'll do one here and here and put like a little cushion clamp just to kind of hold the line in place. That's the stock Suburban 14 bolt brake line standoff right there. So anyhow, that's kind of more or less how I finished up the braking system that'll plug directly into the chassis on the Suburban. I also did take some measurements to make sure that my spring perches are in pretty much the right spot. So I got the two axles, or the two spring perches on the axle sitting exactly the same from one to the other. My digital angle finder is dead, but I got this one to kind of just show you what I found out. I measured on the passenger spring perches on both axles. They're down about 10 degrees. And then I took a comparison on the yoke, which I made sure was vertical. Let's see. This one was about 90 degrees. And just to kind of show you guys what we did here, same thing there, about down 10. And then a measurement here once again. So anyway, on the whiteboard, I wrote down the measurements on Friday. It works out to be down 9.7 on both the Dana 70 and the 14 bolt for the perch. The yoke on the 14 bolt is down 89.2, down 89.8 on the Dana 70 for a difference of 0.6 degrees. So I could take a little bit of time and move the spring perches on the Dana 70 and get them in exactly the same position as they are on the 14 bolt. But one thing to keep in mind is when you're tack welding stuff, it actually moves around. So I fought with these quite a bit just to get them as close as I have them now to the stock Chevy Express perches. Because remember, that's the angle that I was referencing. And here's the other thing, the spring perches on the 14 bolt, they're not even the same angle from one side to the other. When I measured, they're about 1.25 degrees off from one side to the other. So I think my 0.6 degree angle is actually well within the margin of error. And I think the pinion angle is gonna be pretty much where it needs to be, so I don't have any concerns at all. I'm ready to fully weld in the spring perches. I am going to test fit the axle before I do that, but there's one more thing I want to do first, and that's build the shock mounts, just so I'm testing everything that I'm fabricating before I finish weld it and paint it and install this axle for good. So the stock Suburban axle has a shock mount on the front on the passenger side, rear on the driver's side. So that's what we're going to duplicate. We're going to put the shocks in the factory position. And rather than cutting those perches off, I'm just going to be using a set of these 4 tabs I picked up. They're from, I believe, Rough Stuff Specialties. I'll put a link on the screen if I can. They're going to mount the shock in roughly the same position. You can kind of see the hole lines up almost perfectly. I can shorten these just a hair because I think this is for like a 3-inch radius, where the 14 bolt and the Dana 70 use a 3.5-inch axle tube. So you can kind of see how there's a little gap in the middle. So all I'm going to do is take some measurements from the spring perch and then, measure inboard. So I put the shock in the same spot. Like I mentioned, I'm going to grind those. I have a rough measurement on there. Tack weld those guys on, one here, one here. I will put a little reinforcement brace across the back of them, kind of like the stock shocks do. I do need to drill this hole out because that's like 7/16, and I think the shock bolts are like half or a little bit bigger. Anyhow, we'll get the shock tabs mounted on. I will then test fit everything one final time to make sure the new wider Dana 70 fits exactly how I want it. Fully weld everything in, paint it, and then we'll install the axle for good and see how this new Suburban stance is going to look, because believe me, it's going to look so much better being 5 inches wider with this Dana 70. Alrighty, so we've got some really good news. The axle is 100% ready to go underneath the truck, and some not so great news, which possibly means I won't be able to drive the truck right away. And I'll get to that in just a second, but first let me go over all the steps that we took to get the axle to this point. And first, once I verified all the angles were correct, was welding on the shock tabs. You'll notice I did pick up some new Bilstein shocks. These are just off of like rockauto.com, just stock replacements because we're not changing the ride height. You'll notice what I did is I put the shock in there, but I also added an extra little washer. This is 80 thousandths of an inch thick. I stuck that in between when I bolted this whole thing together, and I bolted it together because it helps hold the position even between the two tabs. And the reason for the extra spacer, that's because usually if I weld a tab on like this without any extra space, when you weld it and you have it tightened together, it'll be just a little bit too close, a little bit too tight. And you'll have to like either take a hammer and tap these guys open or take a big adjustable wrench and kind of tweak them just a little bit in order to easily get the shock in and out. And I hate doing that. So when I welded these onto the axle tube, before I put the brace on, I had this 80 thousandths of an inch spacer. Then what I did is after everything cooled down, I also didn't leave the shock on for a long time because you aren't supposed to get these things hot. So I bolted it back together without the spacer, and then what I did is I slowly tightened the nut until I had just a hair of extra clearance, maybe 5 or 10 thousandths, and then I welded the brace on the back, which kind of locks everything together. That way you can get the shocks easily in and out, but whenever you go to tighten the bolt, this metal, even though it's like 1/4 of an inch thick, it'll still easily flex that last little bit, those 10 thousandths of an inch, and tighten up and lock everything in place. So I'm really happy with how the new shocks fit. The next thing that I did was build a couple of standoffs to mount these little cushion clamps that hold the hard line in place. I just took some 1/4-20 nuts, welded them onto the top of the axle tube, and grabbed a really short 1/4-20 bolt. And I have 2 clamps per side. That way it holds everything nice and even, and it kind of has a cool symmetrical look to it. So hard lines are in, flex lines are in. Braking, the only thing I'm going to have to do is make this one connection up underneath. Now on the yoke here, because this axle was left outside for so long, the holes had rusted up, and I tried to put a bolt in there, it just wouldn't go. So I had to go grab a thread tap. This is not 1/4-20, this is 5/16 by 24. It's a SAE fine thread that's tapped into these 4 spots. So I just had to grab some WD-40 and a thread tap and chase those out, and we're all good to go there. Also, I compared between the 2 yokes. These are both, I believe, 1410 pinion yokes between the 14 bolt there and the Dana 70. So my existing U-joint configuration will work perfectly. Now, let's talk about the bad news and what has the potential to allow me not to drive this project right away, which is kind of a bummer, but I was worried this might happen. And that's the drive shaft length. So the Dana 70 has a longer pinion snout, or basically from the center line of the axle to the front of the pinion is longer on the Dana 70 than it was on the 14 bolt. So I took a couple of measurements over here on my board. It's 10.5 from the face of the axle tube on the 14 bolt to the center of the U-joint, and then 12 1/8 on the Dana 70, which means it's 1 5/8 inches longer on the Dana 70 than it is on the 14 bolt. Now, that is not great. The first thing you think is, well, I'm probably going to have the drive shaft shortened, and that's really the best way to tackle this. But I will say, whenever I swapped the transfer case on this thing last fall, I noticed that the yoke on the drive shaft actually didn't engage all the way into the back of the transfer case. Now, obviously, you need to have some room to allow the drive shaft to slide back and forth as the suspension cycles, but compared to some other vehicles I've done, I feel like the pinion yoke, or the slip yoke in the transfer case, was extended quite a bit farther than it probably should have been. So there's a chance I might get lucky and bolt up the new drive shaft, still allowing enough room for it to kind of compress and to do its thing. The other option you could do if you didn't want to have your drive shaft modified, I've done this on a C10 I owned years and years ago, and that's just move the axle back a little bit. Now, the one cool thing about these Perches, you notice there are 3 holes, one in the center line, and there's 1 inch forward and 1 inch backward. I could just use this hole here, which would essentially shift the axle back by 1 inch, and then I'd have to come into the top plate that goes on top of the leaf spring here. And then I could drill another hole that same inch off, so it would sit like that. I don't love that idea though, because it's going to move your wheel back 1 inch, and I feel like on these OBS trucks they did a pretty good job of centering the wheel in the opening. So I'm probably not going to take that route, but just something to keep in mind if you're, say, in an emergency situation, maybe you're swapping an axle and you need to get back to work on Monday. If you have different mounting options, that's something that you can do either permanently, or you can maybe just do it, until you get your drive shaft checked out. This is not my daily driver, so if the stock drive shaft does not fit, I'll just kind of take it or I'll drop the drive shaft off at a local shop here and have it shortened. But anyway, that's enough rambling for this little middle segment. Let's get the axle underneath the Suburban, get some wheels on it, get it on the ground, get the new shocks in place, get the brakes bled, and see how this thing is going to look with its new and improved stance. The axle is fully installed. I got the tires on, it's back on the ground, and I gotta say, I am really, really happy with how this turned out. Now, yes, I could have just put a set of 2.5-inch wheel spacers on this thing and been done with it, but I wouldn't have gained the limited slip and I would not have gained the disc brakes. Now, a quick note on the disc brakes, I am gonna have to do a different master cylinder up front to make this thing function and have the correct brake bias, but I'll do that probably in another video. For now, I just wanted to get this thing on the ground and take a look at it because I am really, really pumped with how this thing turned out. So the wheels right now, they're 2.5 inches out per side compared to where they were. And honestly, just having them out that little bit makes the proportions of the truck look so much better. Now before, this kind of back section right here, for some reason, it just looked odd and weirdly long, but now for some reason just having the tires out that little bit makes everything seem like it's a little bit more in balance and a little bit more in proportion. Now I'm going to put some shots up on the screen here of the Suburban outside so you can really get a good feel for it. Now the back wheels do sit in from the fender well, or the edge of the fender flare, by about 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch on each side. But remember, the rear body of the Suburban is quite a bit wider than the front. And in fact, the tires now, the rear tires track about 1 inch wider than the front. Overall, 1/2 inch per side. So like I said, really happy with how this thing turned out. As far as the drive shaft goes, I'm just barely gonna make it with the drive shaft that's in there. I checked it at full droop and at full compression, and I've got about 1 inch of extra room where I can slide the drive shaft further forward. So we're not going to bottom out there, so I think we're good. The only problem I ran into when I was bleeding the brakes, I noticed the caliper on the right rear side was sticking and it wouldn't release all the way, which kind of is a bummer because those are brand new calipers, but I'll get another one on the way. I didn't have quite enough gear oil to fill this thing all the way up either. So I'll get those two things taken care of, and then we'll get this out on the road, and I'll give you guys a driving impression of how it feels, if there's any difference at all going to a wider axle, because I know a lot of you guys in the comments are like, oh, well, it's for the turning circle. You won't be able to turn around in parking lots anymore. So we'll put that to the test. But that's going to put this video right now to a wrap. So I got to say thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate each and every one of you. Do me a favor though, click the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and of course if you enjoy the content that you see here. Drop a comment down below about what you think about this axle, if I'm totally crazy for spending this much money just to make the wheels stick out, get disc brakes and a limited slip. And then finally head on over to TolmanPerformance.com. There's some merch on there. It kind of helps support the channel if you want a t-shirt or a hat or what have you. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.